chair of the independent inquiry into the Sheffield street tree dispute. Could you please tell us your name and your role?
Yes, I'm Douglas Johnson. I'm a Green Party councillor for City Ward in Sheffield, first elected in 2016. I now lead the Green Group of Councillors, and I came into the administration last year in 2021 as the Executive Member for Climate Change, Environment and Transport. I'm currently the Chair of the Housing Policy Committee.
Great, thank you, and thanks very much for coming today. I do appreciate
You're welcome.
your help. I'm just going to run through a few things I run through with everybody I've invited to come and have this conversation. Please don't take anything from the fact that I'm putting these points to you, because I'm raising with everybody. Firstly, we are broadcasting and recording this, and it will be available, just to make sure you're aware of that and you're happy with that?
Yes, thank you.
Very good. Obviously the dispute generated some quite high feelings and some stress for people and some emotion, and what I'm trying to do here is have some conversations which are conducted in a constructive and cordial way, and one thing we need to avoid doing is saying and broadcasting anything which might be libelous or defamatory or gets in the way of people's entitlement to privacy over their personal data. And if I worry that you may be getting into that kind of territory, I will flag that to you, and if my worries aren't dealt with, then in extreme circumstances I may have to hold the discussion just to make you aware of that. I'm not expecting we'll be in that territory, but I do want to make it clear to everybody that that's what I would do in those circumstances. So as with other people who I've invited to come and have a conversation, I sent you a list of topics I was keen to talk to you about, and we'll work our way through those in a moment. But is there anything you'd like to say by way of opening remarks at the beginning?
Well, you have a written statement in which I put some factual background, which I'm happy for you to use in whatever way is fit. But I just want to reflect briefly, having worked through that statement, on the theme of truth and reconciliation. Very important words that are written into the terms of reference for this inquiry. And of course there are two elements to that, truth and reconciliation. Reconciliation is the issue that we all want to get to. We are where we are and we have to move on, and let's hope there are lessons to be learned. But that involves establishing the truth, and I think we know that's a difficult issue, otherwise we wouldn't be here, but of course it's very important. And I think a bit of a theme of my thought now is that people in the public here in Sheffield want explanations, because a lot of what happened over the past few years seemed to many people to be completely irrational. People were not getting explanations for what was going on in any way that made sense, and that affected the credibility of many people, because when people were given explanations, it was obvious that they weren't true. That's how it seemed to people, and I think a lot of what this inquiry may get to the bottom of is why people acted in the way that they did, because that will help explain, and I think that will be very beneficial to anyone who's been involved in this saga for the last few years. I think that's all I need to say. I'm happy to be led by your questions. Okay,
thank you for that. And thank you for sending us your written statement. I will make that available publicly another time I publish my report with lots of other documentation. Of course, you're perfectly at liberty to make it available yourself in other ways if you want to do that. But
Thank
just
you.
to say, I will include it with other material I make available when I publish my report, which I expect to do in March. So I'll pick up something else you said just now in a moment, but can I just ask you first why you wanted the inquiry?
So I think for the reasons I've just indicated, truth and reconciliation, which has now gone into the terms of reference in a very helpful way. But I think it was about explanation. We had got, by the time this inquiry was set up, we had got to the point where there was some kind of coming together, and there has been significant work by, hard work by people on both sides of the dispute since then to try and move forward, and that's massive credit to those people involved. But this dispute had gone on for a long time, had been incredibly bitter, and had left a lot of people burnt out, emotionally, gutted, and those people deserve an explanation, but really it is what's needed to move forward. So the inquiry came about in the course of negotiations between the Green and Labour groups immediately after the council moved into no overall control in May 2021. And I was pleased that the Labour group were in agreement with us on setting up this inquiry, was recognising that there are benefits to their group too, as well as to us and the public, in actually having a calm and reflective examination of what happened, how did we get to this, and just more understanding, because I think through understanding that there is the chance for a coming together and indeed reconciliation. Without that understanding, I don't think that is achievable.
Yes, okay, thank you. And as you said, when I published my terms of reference, which I wrote on the basis of quite wide consultations, including discussions you and I had and discussions I had with a variety of other people, I included the fact that one of the things the council has said was it wanted a truth and reconciliation process as part of what we were doing. And as you say, both of the words are important. It is my intent that we do the best job we can to explain what happened, why it happened, and then think about how we sustain the recovery that has been ongoing, but also how we avoid the risk of problems emerging into future. That was what was in my mind when I wrote and then published my terms of reference. But I just wanted to check with you whether there was anything else within the scope of my terms of reference that you think it's particularly important that we look at.
So I think looking forwards into the future about what we get out of this, it's easy to say that lessons will be learned, and that's very important. It's important that lessons are learned. The question is how that's done, and also how we remember the lessons that are learned, because things change very quickly, memories fade quickly, and the history of organisations doing things wrong is really the history of organisations forgetting the last time they did something wrong. And the question is, what can we do to embed principles of good practice into the remaining term of this contract? Let's assume it runs until 2037. But also into other areas of, really any area in which the council engages with services that have an impact on the public. So how do we embed the lessons that we learn here? What can be done structurally within the council to make those lessons become part of the operating environment? So it's not just a report on the shelf.
Yeah.
Those are some things there.
Okay. Well, you've just described the difference between a lesson identified and a lesson learned.
Yes.
And it is my aspiration that we do things in a way that lessons can be learned. So you'll have to decide at the end of the process how well we're doing on that. But that's what we all try to do.
Yeah.
So my next question for you is just to ask for your assessment, really, of the current situation in terms of implementing the Streets Ahead contract, including in respect of the Street Trees partnership strategy. And if you just like to share with us any concerns you have about issues that are currently being faced or that you think might arise during the remainder of the contract, which, as you just said, has got another 15 years to run.
Yes, so we're now at the point where everything is much calmer. And obviously the heat has been taken out of this incredibly contentious dispute. But also, of course, we've moved on. We've passed the core investment period, which is meant to be the first 5 years of intense work, and we're in the phase now where it should just be routine maintenance, as you expect an all council to do, until the end of the contract. So things are calmer, things are more balanced, things are more cautious. Now, that doesn't mean that things are perfect. As councillors, local councillors, we get continual complaints and requests from people that are largely to do with the services provided through the Streets Ahead contract, so provided by Amy to the council, whether it's to do with blocked drains, blocked gullies, litter, fly tipping, there's an awful lot of that, even hedges and trees to be trimmed. Occasionally we get people wanting trees to be cut down. Lots of potholes, broken paving stones, so all that routine stuff. On the contentious issue of trees, though, I mean, I'm aware that there are some of the residual trees that were, very contentious in the, that key period. But haven't been resolved, and there genuinely are issues where a tree might be causing, serious deflection to pavements or roads. It's a genuine issue to resolve. Clearly, just cutting down the trees is going to be a very unpopular and option that's going to aggravate people. Equally, there are some cases where leaving it as it is may not be the ideal. And so there's some very careful thought being given now to an increasingly reduced number of problematic trees. I know that the people involved in that process are not finding it easy, but I think they are finding a way forward very, very cautiously. And I think it's right. I think it's a lesson to be learned is actually not to rush into things. The fact is that actually these trees have been there a long while, and just by doing nothing at the moment, they're not going to go anywhere. So it's not a particular crisis. But I am pleased that there is that cautious approach there. It involves people from the council and Amy, but also interested and knowledgeable people from campaign groups, especially Stag, and others. Not entirely sure we're completely there yet, but definitely getting there really. I think what we could look forward to is opening up a more creative approach to solutions. So the issue here is about whether the people involved can move away from looking at it in a fairly narrow highway maintenance sense, and move more onto the question of what do we want this street to look like? How do we want it to function and to operate? What is the street for? Yeah. And actually that ties in very much to a lot of the questions around climate change, transport planning, flood prevention, streets that are safe for children to walk or cycle to school, streets where children can play out, where people can enjoy that. It fits in very much with the concept of pavement cafes, which a lot of bars and cafes are now moving into much more of the street scene. That was really something that took over as they were reopening from the pandemic as a way to support businesses. And it's a whole move of thinking, how can we use streets better? Because, of course, the flip side of a lot of the criticism of having trees on streets is that they impact on people who wanted to use those streets for parking their cars. Many people are now talking about the need to move away from streets as primarily storage for private property of cars, and saying, actually, these are of enormous community benefit if used and managed in the right way. So, in saying that, I've moved quite a long way over from the question of officers dealing with interested residents about specific trees. But I just want to show there is a sort of potential for a continuum of thought there about how we can do this. And if there is inquiry and through history we can show that actually the old approach of highways maintenance, a very hard-line top-down approach, didn't work, what are the alternatives? There is room for creativity here.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed. That's an important and interesting perspective, so thank you very much indeed. So we're now going to take our way through, some of the things that happened, and I'm keen to hear your perspective on them. So let's start sort of at the beginning for you about how and when really you first became aware of the approach the Streets Ahead contract was taking when it came to street trees in Sheffield.
Yes, so I think I first became more involved with it in about 2011. So this was before the contract was signed, but where there was conversation within the council, so publicly, but within the council, about the pros and cons of this looming very big PFI contract. And of course at that stage it simply wasn't something that gripped the public, probably didn't grip most councillors. but the headlines of dealing with Pothole City were very attractive. And my involvement there, I wasn't a councillor, I was an activist. I supported the 2 Green councillors who were around them, and they were really the only ones in the council who were asking those bigger questions about, is this a good idea? And I've had a chance just to go back and look over some of the notes at that time. The question then was, this had been brewing in the council and with central government for a number of years. I saw that the council first put in its expression of interest to the government in 2006. So, of course, that's a very different time from now. It's when Tony Blair was Prime Minister, Gordon Brown was still Chancellor of the Exchequer. The Labour government was in a powerful position to inject large sums of funding into major projects. Also, it was before the financial crash. It was before the financial crash, it was before COVID, it was before, whilst energy prices were going up, it was nothing like the conversation that we're having now. So in very different times then. In 2011, the project was several years underway, and I think the important thing by then was that almost everyone in the council seemed to be wholly bought into it. We'd had administrations run by the Labour group and by the Lib Dems in that period. They'd both fully bought into it. The chief executive at the time was the project sponsor. There were lots of senior officers who were all fully on board with this. And it just became difficult for anyone outside that group, and there weren't many, to question, are we sure this still makes sense? But also, there was an attitude that that questioning provoked hostility from the council leadership at the time, because it was seen as criticism, which they weren't really open to. That was my involvement then. I think you're edging to ask another version
yes,
of that.
Okay, yes. No, thank you very much for that, though, because that is it's a helpful. It is a helpful perspective. So, the sort of follow-on question is: so you had a number of concerns, or others you were discussing issues with had a number of concerns, and so, the next obvious question is: so how did you bring those into the conversation and seek to get them addressed?
So I was supporting the council. The councillors were able to raise those publicly. So they were using the council processes available to us then. So motions at council, written questions, which are all on the public record, debates in council, speeches, and so on. And those were, looking back at the words now, they were very prescient. They were actually asking exactly the right questions. But actually they had limited outlet there. And you have to bear in mind that the culture of the council then meant that it was very, very difficult for opposition councillors to get information out of the administration, so both the senior councillors and the senior officers. Information was very tightly controlled, publicity was controlled, and ultimately these two councillors were really just acting on their own. It was, councillors are meant to be doing these things almost in their spare time. The debates there raised the question of how much are we actually spending on this? How much comes out of council money and how much is the government money? How much is actually being spent on fixing roads? Given that, we equally agreed that the state of the roads was really bad. There were potholes and that affects everyone. But how much was being spent on interest payments on this massive amount of borrowing? How much was actually going to the service that people wanted of replacing potholes? Questions about what were the implications of privatising a large section of the workforce and taking them out of control. I even noticed that they raised questions about, what happens if we tied in this 25-year contract and energy prices go up? Now, of course, this year, that seems very prescient. When we talk about things like lighting contracts and the huge amount of inflation right across the board in construction industries, that's very relevant. That's where we are. We're still tied to this contract for another 15 years. And then the other thing to refer to is that by the time this contract came to be signed, which wasn't until 2012, it was over 2 years after the Conservative success in the 2010 elections. We were well into 2 years of austerity. There'd been the very thorough comprehensive spending review starting about September 2010. So there was no mistake that we were definitely in a period of austerity. But also, by that time, in 2011, there was a very damning report about PFIs from the Treasury Select Committee. And that's obviously a very significant parliamentary committee. It wasn't looking at local authority PFIs, because there weren't many of them, but they looked at how PFIs had operated throughout the previous government around principally hospitals and schools. And I think the phrase they used was that they were extremely inefficient value for money for the taxpayer. That report, fully on the public record, well reported on, completely saw through PFIs. And so the two Green Councillors here were asking the question, are you sure we still want to go ahead with this? The specific proposal in a motion which Council voted on was whether to delay the signing of the contract, to just take some time to pause and reflect on that. And a very clear vote on that, where all the Labour and all the Lib Dem councillors voted strongly to offer their wholehearted support, I think was the phrase used in one of the written motions, to proceed and not to delay at all. So that was the context there. So there were people asking questions, but there weren't enough people listening to the answers. And also, it wasn't something that just engaged the wider public. And this is often the way with the big decisions. By the time interested members of the public come to feel those, which is when they see the trees being cut down outside their house, it's too late because the decision's already been made and the contracts have been signed. But that was the sort of context back in 2011. All the warning signs were there.
Very good, very illuminating set of perspectives again. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
So, the contract was then signed in 2012.
Yes.
Could you then take us through your assessment of how things panned out in the following years, and in particular, how your concerns evolved, especially in the period of, if you like, the height of the dispute between 2015 to 2018. I know there's a lot to talk about there, but if you could give us your
yes.
take.
So I won't go through all the detail because there will be other witnesses who can give that. But my take on it is the contract was signed in June 2012. I think it came to force in August 2012. There was a period of mobilisation. So I don't think there was much tree felling over that winter. And bear in mind that tree felling is normally a winter operation. But by the following summer in 2013, people were already getting agitated about that. There was quite a bit of concern by the public about cutting down a large number of trees at the roundabout at Meadowhead, large roundabout in the middle of a large road. And strictly speaking, I think that wasn't inside the Streets Ahead contract. It was another project, but it was indicative of people's reaction to the loss of impressive trees. And then there were also some trees being felled on roads, which people were unhappy with. So that was in the summer of 2013. And it came to a head at a public meeting in October 2013, and I remember this. I was there. It was held at St Mary's Church. It was organised by Gillian Creasy, who was the senior Green Councillor then, with Professor Ian Rotherham from Sheffield University as a well-known ecologist in the city. And there was also the cabinet member, the Labour cabinet member then, Jack Scott, who attended. It was good for him for agreeing to attend. There were senior members there from the council. I think Steve Robinson was there, and people from Amy. There to answer questions. The room was packed out. People were there, but people were already describing the fact that trees had been cut down and it affected them emotionally. It made a huge difference to their street. It was done unexpectedly, without warning, and where their concerns were just brushed off. And that was only in 2013. That was only the first year of the contract there. And what that should have done is it should have alerted the council and Amy to the fact that actually people feel really strongly about the trees. The PFI contract actually covers lots of resurfacing of pavements, fixing bridges, resurfacing roads, clearing drains, all sorts of stuff, lighting, cables, linking up traffic lights. Actually, people don't really get agitated about those. It's all routine, good stuff that needs doing. When it comes to cutting down mature trees, people really value their trees. That was probably underestimated by the officers there, but they were very clearly told at that meeting. The other theme of that meeting was about the lack of consultation. People were saying they were just being informed. They weren't being asked about their views on having trees on their street, which really makes up the character of their street. And remember, there was one man there, it was literally a man, in tears, talking about having to take his daughter to nursery past these trees being cut down, and and she was saying, "Why have they taken the trees? It looks awful." Yeah. It was that sort of level of emotional engagement, and I think that, certainly with hindsight, that should have been given a lot more weight to. It wasn't. It was a real missed opportunity because, as I said, all the information was there. With the consultation, now the interesting bit about that unfolded, so I checked with Gillian and checked some notes of a meeting that she'd had afterwards with the cabinet member, the officers later on, to follow up on that public meeting and say, what can we draw out of this, what can we learn? And it seems that the view they took was that consultation wasn't needed. The reason it wasn't needed is because the principle of the PFI contract was that it was like-for-like replacement. So pavements and roads would be resurfaced in the way that they would have been originally. Street light columns would be replaced in the places where they had been. There was no intention to make any improvements. Now, also I might say that actually that was a massive missed opportunity. There could have been so much done to improve, but that wasn't the case. But because they took that line, they thought that it was simply a case of replacing trees. They didn't seem to understand that replacing a small tree that you can actually plant is not the same as removing a 100-year-old mature tree that's got so much character. But it also just did not seem to understand that that would affect people. People would want to be consulted and want to have their say. And they just felt it wasn't necessary. So they weren't going to do it. That came across. The other thing that came across there, and this is, again, really illuminating in the light of later events, was that, so Gillian Creasy noted that in the meeting they were all very pally. The cabinet member, the council officers, the Amy staff. And of course the relationship between the council and Amy was meant to be a firm, hard legal contract, calling to account with specific measures and performance outcomes and monitoring and so on. But they're all very pally. Possibly that's because actually a lot of the people then working for Amy, I think, had transferred over, and given that the council had transferred over its large part of its workforce. So there were personal relationships there, and perhaps that indicates that it was not going to be possible or realistic to expect that it would be monitored in the way that the contract it sets up, which of course was the only way that there was a formal way of monitoring the performance of Amy. So that palliness, blokiness possibly, just set that down there. I think what it would mean is that actually there was no way in for someone who got a different view of the values that were being talked about, the values of trees on streets, the value of talking to people, the value of engaging with the community or respecting their wishes or even gathering their wishes. So that was all 2013. I'm dwelling on the early days there, because I said that other people will recount what happened in 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018 onwards. But I think that was all setting the tone there, really.
Very good. Thank you very much. Is there anything else you want to say on the period 2014, 15, 16, 17, 18?
Yes. So I think what characterised it was increasing levels of determination by the council and Amy to press ahead with this programme, equally increasing determination by many members of the public that this was not acceptable, that it should be opposed to different degrees and different extents, and different intensities, but increasing levels of opposition to each other that naturally led to increasing levels of confrontation. And then you saw some, utterly astounding incidents. So obviously the dawn raid on Rustling's Road stands out as a highlight in everyone's memory, and of course was reported across the world. People think, what on earth was going on there? The fact that the council and Amy had managed to engage South Yorkshire Police and enlist them to what were actually not really criminal offences about, people trying to do their jobs and wanting the police to help them out, but the story of arresting pensioners. There's someone who got arrested for tooting on a plastic recorder. When the police finally pulled out of trying to get involved in highway maintenance, the council moved over towards a much harder approach to trying to enforce its legal rights through cracking down on the public through civil proceedings. So we had long-running injunction proceedings against a number of people, including elected councillor Alison Teal, attempts to imprison some of those people. So we had the actually kind of frightening situation where the council was actually applying to court for an order to imprison one of its own democratically elected councillors from an opposition party. That is not what you expect to see in frankly, in a Western democracy, any democracy. It really does look like, an utter abuse of power. And I think that's what it was drifting to, which everyone outside the council could see, but it was that determination within the council to press ahead. And going back to the question I was asking earlier on about, establishing the truth, why did they act as that? And I think it was becoming increasingly incomprehensible. It really didn't make sense to anyone. So, of course, it was a mixture of making the council look like a laughing stock, but at the same time saying, well, actually, it would be funny if it were a joke. Actually, it's not funny at all. People got incredibly embroiled in this. As I said, people in the campaign groups and in the workforces spent hours standing around in the snow, in the cold. People got hurt as they were pressed up against fences in the later really confrontational parts of the funding and the protests there. I think someone had their hand broken in offence by as there were increasing numbers of external hired security. It got very nasty, really nasty at times, and that was plainly unacceptable. I think it's still very difficult to answer how on earth did it get to that point, but it did. I mean, so my personal opinion is that it was natural approach by the campaigners who were reacting, but the reason that the council and Amy together wanted to go ahead is just that no one had the strength really to recognise that this was all looking very stupid and there was simply no need. It was almost as if they were going out just looking for a fight to pick. I think because they thought they could win. And I think that's the key thing. What you end up with was an administration, a relatively small number of senior councillors, senior officers, senior staff in Amy, presumably senior people in the police and a few others, who were so heavily embroiled in this campaign where they felt they were being attacked on all sides, criticised continually for handling it badly, became more and more determined to press ahead, and they thought that they could crush the opposition. These are the opposition, not just being opposition councillors or the press, but really the entire public. And they thought they could do that and could win and could show strength. Now, that's a personal view. I'm doing my best to rationalise what drove them onwards, instead of just taking the far easier option of saying, actually, let's just all chill out a bit. Let's just think about this. Let's talk and see what's a better way forward. We don't need to cut all these trees down, or not straight away. It would have been easy to do that, but they chose the more difficult path. And yeah, that's difficult. My thought is that they thought they could win this fight against the public, and they only backed down, and when they moved to the conciliation phase, when they realised that they had lost.
Okay, I see. Well, thank you very much indeed for that. That's, I mean, it's an important perspective. You set it out very clearly, and it's helpful for me to understand that perspective. As you alluded to the fact that other people who I'm inviting to have a conversation may add some things in various directions, actually, to what you said. So thank you.
Yeah.
You sort of touched on this, but I wonder if there's anything else you want to say about your sort of understanding or assessment of the impact of the programme to date. I mean, that includes the impact on the roads and pavements and street lights, but it also includes the impact of and the kind of consequences of other things that happen, which you've described, which attracted controversy and opposition.
Yes. So the impact of the contract that was signed, we are in a position now where actually the majority of our pavements and roads are in far better condition in terms of surfaces. It's easy to forget now how much Sheffield was called Pothole City at the time, and I think we're beginning to recognise that we are better. That's good for everyone. People who walk and cycle as well as those who drive. So that is good. That's obviously come at a huge cost. The fact is that we're in a hugely expensive contract. We are suffering from that now. It's well known that Sheffield City Council has got major budget crises at the moment affecting every service of the council. It's really being cut back. At the same time, we have to pay more and more each year under this contract. So it's important to recognise that for every service in the council that's had its budget reduced over the last 10 years, the cost of this contract has increased. There's apart from minor bits where there's been cuts in service that have been agreed, it's been an increase because that is a requirement of the contract. So it's been hugely costly. But the bigger picture is about the confidence, the way that the council has looked, the reputation. As I noted before, the story of Sheffield's trees was literally reported around the world. It became a bit of a phrase of doing a Sheffield, of cutting down trees or doing anything else in the face of huge public opposition. It just made the council look foolish, oppressive, heavy-handed, and frankly out of control. That didn't help, and of course Sheffield still has the remnants of that reputation. There is good work now being done on a fresher approach to street trees and other things, but we have had to move on a long way. A really interesting consequence, and a direct consequence of the Trees campaign was the campaign for a referendum to change the entire structure of the council's governance. So the actual change of the governance is a bit of a dry issue, but the fact that there was a public campaign to gain a huge number of signatures on a petition that actually legally forced the council to have a referendum. The council didn't have a referendum on the governance change willingly. It was invited to do so, refused. The referendum triggered the legal requirement to force the referendum. The referendum forced the council to change from the strong leader and cabinet model to a modern committee system. Again, not through the council's choice, it was forced on it. But it was a direct consequence of the hugely popular uprising against the council. So we've got that. And of course it is the ongoing costs that are a legacy of this. And the question that I don't know that it was ever discussed. What would have happened had we decided not to go into a PFI, but had simply increased the amount of spending we had on highway maintenance to the same level that we've actually increased our council contribution? That would have meant we could have done a lot more resurfacing without incurring this massive debt, but also giving us the flexibility now to make proportionate responses so that we could make choices between not resurfacing this road or not cutting this children's service. As it is, the consequence of the contract is that our hands are tied. We have to cut this children's service because we have to resurface this road even though we might not want to now. And just bearing in mind, and one of the criticisms I made of the resurfacing was that roads were resurfaced when, actually, frankly, it's hard to see that they were priorities. So I'm talking about not main roads that people use a lot, but side roads to redundant factories. There's one in particular I noticed. There was a very nice resurfacing of quite a long road going up to the defunct Sheffield ski slope. There is nothing up there now apart from fly tipping. I'm not sure that it needed resurfacing and new streetlights putting in, but they were performance indicators under the contract. Amy was able to do that and claimed that it's resurfaced, yet another set of metres of road. If you had that service in-house, you were able to say, look, let's not spend our money on that, let's spend it on something else instead. As a council, we've had those options for budgeting taken away from us by the decision to outsource it and sign the contract. So there's lots of different ways there. So financially, environmentally, reputationally, and then going back to perhaps the biggest thing is about the confidence of people in the city, in their council that ultimately is elected and has to run the city in significant ways right across the board. It's a bit of a challenge for democracy. I think we are in a better place now, but that's really because the council's had to move to a committee system and no overall control, so there's no single dominant party. So, those are a lot of the issues there about where we are.
Okay, no, thank you. That's again, clear and comprehensive response to my question, so thank you. Now, I know that you weren't involved at the time, and you weren't until 2021 among the governing parties of the council, but you have a lot of knowledge about what happened, as you've displayed already in our discussion today. I just wonder if you have a theory or a hypothesis as to why what turned out to be the controversial elements of the programme, especially those related to street trees, were designed and then incorporated into the contract in 2012 in the way they were. Why did that happen?
Yes. I don't know for definite, but my assumption from piecing this together is that actually the trees issue wasn't seen as such a major issue for the people devising what was essentially a highways programme. I think it was the whole PFI project, given that it was fixated on pothole city, it was very much looking at the surface of roads. People were talking about resurfacing the carriageways, resurfacing the footways, replacing street lights. And so all the other things were brought into it, including trees that were seen as sort of ancillary to that, really. Trees, drains, bridges, whatever. Important things, but, bolt-on attachments to the highway. So I think actually that the people devising the PFI programme just underestimated that people are emotional about trees in the way they're just not really emotional about traffic lights or bridges. It's simple to say that now, and it's pretty obvious with hindsight, but I think it was probably overlooked. It was known, it was certainly known that cutting down trees can induce a lot of controversy and complaint, but it perhaps wasn't considered to be, it wasn't considered that it would unfold to the extent that it did. It clearly was anticipated because, of course, in the contract, and this is from a fairly early day, is that it specifically addresses the issue of protest and trespass. So clause 19 of the contract specifically anticipates that there will be protest and trespass about something, and that it places the responsibility for managing that firmly on Amy, not on the council at all. In terms of the council negotiation, that was actually a really good outcome of that negotiating point, to make sure that it was simply did not have to be involved with managing process at all. That was absolutely clearly Amy's job. So, of course, one of the big unanswered questions is, given that, why did the council itself, as opposed to Amy, wade in and put so much energy and confrontation, the desire to ramp things up, why did it get involved with protests at all? It didn't need to. It had secured a contractual right to sidestep all that and leave it to Amy. It didn't. I don't know the answer to that at all. But it was clearly foresaw to some extent. I think had they obviously thought that there would be such a degree of protest, then they must have taken a different line when the contract was being formed. So I don't know. It does seem to me, though, that in the sort of public statements, it was possibly downplayed how many trees would be replaced. So for a long time, there was controversy over the elements of the contract that were secret, and it was a big revelation when it was unveiled when it unveiled the part of the contract that specifically referred to 17,500 trees out of the total stock of 36,000 being cut down. Because that was realised that not only was that a huge number, but actually a number was specified in the contract. Actually, that had been known. So if you look at professional journal, I think Transportation Journal from 2011 or something, it referred to half the city's trees will be cut down. So of interest to professionals, but just not in the wider public. But I think people were shocked when they realised what that was. And that meant not just, a number of small trees that were dead, but actually big, healthy, mature trees that are an important feature in particular streets.
And did you ever, or have you ever identified a sort of rationale for, or do you have a hypothesis about what the rationale for, as you just described it, planning to remove such a large number of mature trees was?
I think my understanding is from a strict highways point of view. So once you take out all the emotional attachment of trees, from a highway engineer's point of view, people who want to lay down new tarmac see trees as obstructions. Because, of course, it's certainly true. I mean, trees do disrupt pavements and tarmac. The roots grow underground and, make things crack and bulge. Actually, from the sort of having, a nice straight, flat road, it's much easier if you don't have trees at all. And, of course, that completely overlooks the immense value that trees bring to streets, both emotionally, environmentally, ecologically, in terms of, cooling and shading and just the beauty of streets, which is easy to overlook.
So let me just check if I've understood what you just said. Your theory is that the rationale in the minds of the people designing the plan for removing 17,500 trees, as you've described the intent being in your understanding, the rationale was to make it easier to manage the highways and pavements and so on. That's your theory.
That's my hypothesis, because I can see that makes sense. But I don't know exactly what was discussed, because I haven't seen any records of discussions, any explanation of how we got to that position. It seems to be very quiet. And it seems that in the briefings to councillors that were given round about that time, so before and after the contract was signed, there was only passing reference to the number of trees being removed or just replaced, as they put it.
Yeah.
So it wasn't really dwelt on. The focus was on resurfacing roads and pavements, really.
Right.
So I think the significance of the import of what was actually intended for the trees wasn't brought out at all, and it only became apparent later on when people actually saw nice big trees being cut down on their streets.
Yes.
And then it was brought home to people.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Thank you again for giving us your hypothesis on that. So I want to move on now to something again where I know you weren't directly involved, so I'm giving you an opportunity to hypothesise possibly, or to tell us what insight you've generated. But my question is, you have described how from 2013 you saw evidence that what was starting to happen was provoking controversy and some opposition. And that, as you've said, grew over the following years. And my question really is why it proved so difficult, particularly in the period from late 2016 through 2017 to the beginning of 2018, why it proved so difficult to resolve the dispute when it turned out that from the spring of 2018, it proved actually not so difficult to resolve it.
I think it depends on whether you're looking at that question externally to the council or internally. Because if you look at it externally, then in an objective sense, it wasn't difficult to resolve that. It was quite easy to do. It was quite easy to do just by the council saying, right, well, we'll just stop all this controversial stuff and we'll talk to people, think about it. Because that is what happened later in 2018. There was a decision then to pause the felling, have time out, in other words. That could have been done several years before. So you're looking externally, you're saying, well, why wasn't that done before? It makes it look as though it was just like the administration basically wanted to pick a fight with the public. It wanted to show strength and it wanted to force its aims through. That's one hypothesis, but I think I'm probably not alone in really struggling to understand what was the rationale there. I think what's more interesting is when you look at it internally from the council, and maybe there's other witnesses who can give much more definitive answers to what the thinking was internally then. I think the difficulty, though, was that those heavily involved with the operational side and the actual decision-making and strategy by then had become so involved with it that it was very difficult for them to back down in any way, because it would have meant losing face, to use that phrase. The consequences would have been very serious to the established way of thinking of things then. They would have worried about the impact of the programme, the sort of delays, the cost implications, if they were, not because they would be difficult to resolve, but that they would then be things that would need resolving. And it just wasn't something, I think, that they were prepared for or equipped for. And they still thought it was easier just to try and crush dissent. Again, I mean, I don't know, because, of course, although by 2016-17 I was an elected councillor, as an opposition councillor then, you were completely on the outside. Basically, you knew what was published in the Star. Councillors didn't get any real special insight that any other member of the public didn't get. Yeah. So I think, yes, internally. And I think it probably became difficult for council staff to say, hold on folks, let's think about this, because they would have looked weak with their colleagues in Amy. And vice versa, equally, people in Amy wouldn't want to be saying, well, actually, this is getting a bit bad for us, we're putting our staff at risk here, or whatever. They didn't want to do that because they'd look weak in terms of the council, and both parties might have thought, well, what will be the contractual implications? What if the other set wanted to claim money from us? I don't know. I mean, we're into hypotheses here because I wasn't involved in those conversations. But I think it is worth looking at, when you look at it from the external, which is easy to answer, or the internal point of view, where I think it's very complex and probably revolves around personalities and what people thought they could, get away with without losing face, as I said.
Okay, so fair enough. And I've invited you to hypothesise on something that you don't have detailed information on for reasons you've explained, but of course I do have quite a lot of information on, and we'll be able to explore further. So my next question for you is, and again I'm asking you to take benefit of hindsight, which of course is a luxury that we can do, and I'm also recognising your knowledge was probably limited and that you weren't closely involved at the time, but you've developed a series of interesting hypotheses on a range of things. Have you got ideas on what might have been done differently by any of the main stakeholders, actually? I'm not focusing on particularly one, but I am including the council. Who might have done what differently in order to, reduce the scale of the problem that was encountered and have it solved more straightforwardly?
Okay, so you think through the things that I've said already, one thing that might have been done differently is simply to review and reflect on the merits of signing the PFI in the first place. The council could instead have said, now things have changed now we're into the period of austerity, we'll not sign this PFI, but we have made the promise to the people of Sheffield and therefore we'll commit to increasing the amount of spending on highways maintenance, which in fact they have committed to under the contract. They could have done that. That would have been a very different situation that we're in now. Secondly, if you look at the 2013 meeting I mentioned, when it was brought to the direct attention of council officers and cabinet members of people's emotional reaction to the felling of trees, that could have been taken on board if the council had been more emotionally astute. It might have said, yes, we recognise that we can't just cut down all the trees we were planning to. We'll have to rethink this and soft pedal or whatever. Just talk to people, consult. As the protests escalated, they could at any time have done what they actually did in 2018, which was to say, this is not looking good for anyone. Let's just pause this. We might need to come back to it, but let's pause it for now, talk to people. Later on, there were talks mediated by the Bishop of Sheffield, for instance, which seemed to be constructive and helpful. Something like that could have been done at an earlier stage. So certainly those can be done. I mean, on the campaigners' side, there is probably, it's hard to say what the thing they could have done differently apart from simply not campaigned. If people had not campaigned, they would still be unhappy. The street scene would look very different. The damage would have been done. People would feel cheated. And I think people would have felt that people made the choice to come out and campaign in lots and lots of different ways. Yes. Some were incredibly active, some were, much more passive, but very clearly demonstrating their support, whether it's even just, online. So some campaigners were, very committed. There were some people from the council and from Amy and the police would have said that, they went too far. By breaking the law, by climbing over fences, trespassing and so on, and you're in there into areas of legitimate democratic protest. That was the subject matter of the claim for the injunctions by the council, and that balance is what the High Court had to deal with, and that's in the judgment of Mrs. Justice Mayles on that case. That's balanced up there. In other words, people could have just let the council go ahead with that. The fact that people didn't do that, and it wasn't just a one-off process, this was a committed and persistent campaign over many years, which just tells you that people must have felt strongly about this issue in big numbers, really big numbers. It's bigger than anything else that we've had a protest over in Sheffield. And it was across the city. I think something I hadn't mentioned earlier on was, if you like, the political aspect of weaponising class issues, if you like. So often I've had it said that the protests were only a few people in the leafy suburbs who were worried about their house prices. And of course, that's not true. I happen to live in Pittsmore. It's a fairly deprived area of the city. And I know there that there were people who were, incredibly offended by the fact that the council just came and cut down some really beautiful trees there that were just on ordinary streets. I remember in particular one, a really quite old woman who was furious about the fact that, the council cut down these cherry trees that blossomed with a beautiful pink in the spring, right outside her flat. And actually, she wasn't on social media. She wasn't actually aware of stuff that was going off in quite a big way in other parts of the city, right across the city. She was a proper old communist. Literally, she'd been through the political battles. She was actually not that aware of what else was going on, but she was so angry because she really valued the benefit that those trees bring to people in deprived areas. Sorry, a bit of a tangent there, but it's just an important thing to bring in, that that could have been done differently. there was an awful lot of spin put on the communications from the council, and I think that was more offensive than any exaggeration of the campaign brought by protesters. General rule in politics is the public can say pretty well what they like. They don't have to be accountable. They're just opinions. If the council uses its own publicly funded communication service to put out stuff that is really misleading, a bit untrue, then that's not acceptable. And of course, in that context, we had a finding by the local government ombudsman that the council had behaved so badly it had overstepped the mark into actual dishonesty in its service, and that's as a corporate service. And that's not acceptable. All those things are things that could have been done differently. So, really, I suppose I'm saying that those involved with responding to the public could have acted with more integrity than in fact they did.
Yes.
It was not good enough.
Okay.
Probably lots of other things that could be done, but I have to take a lead from you on that question.
Again, it's a clear answer to my question. I understand your perspective is very well articulated, if you don't mind me saying so. Now, one of the other things I said I would try to help with in my terms of reference is the minimisation of the risk of similar problems re-emerging in future. Obviously, I've got a particular interest in the street trees issues, but people have said to me, are there risks in other areas as well? So I don't know if there's anything you would like to tell us about what might be done to minimise other big problems crystallising.
Yes, okay. So, the council in all its functions has to make decisions and do things that impact on the public. And, that's the case now. There's still the remaining street trees that I mentioned. There's lots of other things too. Quite a controversial issue at the moment are traffic schemes. Transport schemes are always controversial. Lots of moves to improve the walking and cycling infrastructure of the city, proposals about bus lanes, about enforcement of parking and so on, active travel neighbourhoods. They've generated quite a lot of opposition there, but also a lot of support. So another confrontational issue potentially. The council's really got to get to grips with being able to manage that, and that means essentially talking to people on the level, genuinely taking into account people's views, and just finding ways to have dialogue. Usually find that when people do speak, when they feel being listened to and actually have conversations, then people will be prepared to accept something even if they don't agree with it, and that can be done. It doesn't work to bulldoze things through, so that's some element of what we've got to do to bring people together and essentially just be more conciliatory. The flip side of that is actually being less arrogant. So if we go ahead with schemes as a council, we mustn't go in there and think, well, we've decided this is what it is, and we're convinced it's for the right reasons, we're convinced it's the best thing available. It is possible that we're wrong, or even that we're right, but that other people have different views.
Yes.
And that is something that we need to have a mechanism for dealing with. So it is an approach about taking people with us, but at the same time actually making firm decisions, but being consistent as well. So, of course, a lot of the criticism of the campaign was that the council was just inconsistent in all sorts of ways. It does boil down to communication, but actually just allowing people's voices to be heard. I think a lot of what went on over this was about excluding people's highly articulated comments for many years about things that were clearly important to very large numbers of people. That's a clear mistake.
Yes.
It's something the council shouldn't have done. So if you can just avoid that. And so if you look at how they're dealing with the street trees now, then there are some quite careful and cautious conversations going on about each tree individually and what can be done around that. So, I mean, others will. You've got Christine King, I think, going to give evidence. She'll be able to give the detail on that, but I simply don't know. She's much more involved with that, and she'll have some good insights, I'm sure. There is something about recognising that you can't please everyone. So this is a bit to do with being consistent. The council is always in a position where actually it does have to make decisions. There's a lot of trying to please everyone with the result that you please no one at all. The other side of that is about being able to explain what are the reasons in a way that people understand and to the extent that they accept. Being able to explain what are the reasons for doing this particular project. Because, as I indicated before, a lot of what went on the Free Ferry just made no sense to people. It was quite obvious to people that there was an easier way forward. Often just meant backing off and just not doing anything with a particular tree. And then if we go home, there's plenty of other jobs for Amy to be doing and repairing the city's roads. So it just made no sense for the council and its partners to take a really belligerent attitude towards the public. So that's certainly something that you can learn just by identifying where there are protests or dissent and making a firm decision either to try and address it rationally or to accept that there's another way forward and it's a change to what the council had already proposed. Might be more there, but yes, about avoiding recurrence.
Okay, no, that's great, thank you. Well, look, I've asked you a lot of questions,
yes,
and you've provided me with very interesting and informative and thoughtful answers. I really do appreciate it. Is there anything you've not had a chance to say yet that you'd like to say?
As always, these situations, I'll think about it the moment I've left the room. I think we've covered a lot in there. I think the really important things are, going back to the truth and reconciliation issues. There's still a lot of gaps, certainly a lot of gaps in my knowledge. You're compiling it, and it'll be really useful to hear from other witnesses as to what went on, to explain a rational, coherent explanation of how we got to where we did. It was an absurd situation in many cases. We need to understand where we got there. I think all the signs are there for much, much better working relationships in the future. But the much harder part, I think, is about how we keep hold of those and embed that. And I don't at this stage have any magic answers on exactly how to do that, apart from keeping the dialogue going.
Okay. Well, look, if there are other things that occur to you, we'd be thrilled to hear further from you.
Thank you.
As you have alluded to, other people are coming to have a chat with me as well. The names of some of those people and the dates we've already put on the website. There are other people beyond that who have agreed to come, and other people who we've yet to approach, I hope will come. These discussions are only obviously one part of how we are building up the picture. As you're probably aware, we're having a very large number of private discussions with people as well, and we have a huge volume of documentation, and we'll take all of that information and do the best we can to do justice to it all in trying to fulfil the terms of reference in our report, which I plan to have published by March. So in the meantime, thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome. Thanks very much, and I'm very happy to provide any more information if it helps.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. That concludes the session, Charles. Thank you. You can switch